Welcome back to On the Same Page. We are on Daf Chaf Tes Amud Beis 29b of Meseches Kiddushin. We are starting from 2 lines from the bottom of the page. Last week at the end we were discussing the ideal age for a person to get married, for a man to get married, and we saw the opinion of Rav Huna, who said that 20 years old is too late, and we saw the same thing from Rava and Tamar Devei Rabbi Shmuel. Now the Gemara says, 2 lines from the bottom, towards the end of the line, Amar Rav Chisda said, Hai di'adifna mechavrai. That which I turned out better than my friends, I became a greater person, is dinasivna b'shitzar. It's because I got married at 16. I got married young, and that helped me become a great person. And had I gotten married at 14, top of the next page, Havamina, then I would have been able to say with Satan, to the Yetzer Hara, to the evil inclination, Gira beinecha, an arrow in your eye. If I had gotten married even younger, it would have been even better, and I would have been so, mighty in a certain sense, in terms of my ability to combat the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination. I would have taken him head on and said, an arrow to your eye. Okay. Amar le Rava le Reb Nassan bar Ami. Rava said to Reb Nassan bar Ami, Adiyadcha tzavari divrech, while your hand is still on the neck of your child, meaning, while he's still under your control, you should, the Gemara actually doesn't say what it is that he should do. Rashi's first interpretation is you should marry him off, but then Rashi actually prefers that you should rebuke him, you should teach him, because we'll see when he's too young, he's too immature, he's not going to receive it. When he's too old, he's not going to listen. But there's an age range where your hand is on his neck, you can guide him properly, that's when you should take advantage. So when is that? Mishitzar v'ad esrim v'tarti. From the age of 16 until 22. That's the ideal time to teach him, to guide him, to rebuke him. The Amri line, some say mitmani sreyad esrim ve'arba. Some say from 18 to 24. Some say 16 to 22. Some say 18 to 24. Kitanayim, in fact, that is a machlokes. It's a dispute between 2 Tanaim. They quote the pasuk, the verse in Mishlei, in Proverbs, that says, Chanoch lanar al pidarko, teach or train the child in his way, based on his way. And what is the na'ar, train a lad, what age is that? Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Nechemia, it's a dispute between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nechemia. Chad Amar, one says, Mishitzar v'ad esrim v'tartin, one says from 16 until 22. V'chad Amar, and one says, Mitman Yisrei v'ad esrim v'arba, and one says from 18 until 24. That is the ideal time to impress your opinions and your guidance upon your son. Again, the way Rashi says it is before that age, he doesn't have the proper das, the proper intellect to accept your rebuke and your teaching. And when he's older than 22 or 24, so he might just reject it outright, but that's the sweet spot is between those ages, between either 16 and 22 or 18 and 24. Okay, the Gemara now comes back to the obligation of the father to teach the son Torah, and it says, Ad heichan chayev adam l'lamed es beno Torah. Until what extent is a person obligated to teach his son Torah? Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Rav Yehuda says the name of Shmuel, Kigon Zvulun ben Dan. We could take an example from Zvulun, the son of Dan. This is not talking about the Shvatim, they were brothers, Zvulun and Dan. This is something in time of the Gemara. Zvulun is the son of Dan. Shelimdo avi aviv, that his grandfather, so the father of Dan in this case, taught Zvulun Mikra. So Mikra is like Tanakh, the verses. Mishnah, the Mishnah of a Talmud and the elaboration on the Mishnah, halachos, all of halacha, the agados, as well as the ethical teachings and stories of the tradition. So he taught him that. So the Gemara seems to understand the question was to what extent, meaning how much does the father have to teach the child? And the answer is, look at Zevulun ben Dan, who's even his grandfather, it wasn't even him, it was the grandfather taught his grandson all of these things. Tanakh, Mikra, Mishnah, Talmud, Halacha, Agada, all of it. As the Gemara may say, we have a contradiction from a Brisa. It says, Lamdo Mikra, Ein Melamdo Mishnah. The Brisa says that once he taught him Mikra, meaning the verses of the Tanakh, he doesn't have to teach him Mishnah. So it seems that it's sufficient for the father to fulfill his obligation to teach his child, teach his son, to teach him Mikra, teach him Tanakh. V'amar Rava, and Rava said, Mikra zu Torah. Mikra is Torah. So actually it's not even Tanakh. It's Torah, the 5 books. Not Navi, not the prophets, not Ksuvim, not the writings, just Torah. Just the 5 books of Moshe. So the Gemara asked, to what extent is one required to teach their son Torah? It said, like Zvulun ben Dan, the grandfather there taught him everything. Torah, Mishnah, Talmud, Halacha, Agada, everything. So the Gemara says, yeah, but we have a contradiction. The Brisa says you just have to teach him Torah. The 5 books, that's it. So says the Gemara, that's true. Really what we meant from bringing an example from Zvulun ben Dan was the following. Kiz Zvulun ben Dan, v'lo kiz Zvulun ben Dan. Like Zvulun ben Dan, but also not like him. Meaning in certain regards like him, in certain regards not like him. Kiz Zvulun ben Dan, shelamdo avi aviv. Like Zvulun ben Dan, that his grandfather taught him. Meaning, we maybe misunderstood the original question. The question was, Ad heichan Adam chayiv Adam lamidus beno Torah. To what extent is a person obligated to teach his son Torah? And the answer is, or really the question is, until what generation are you required? And the answer is, even to the 2nd generation, even to your grandson. That was the question. To what extent, meaning to what generation do you have to teach your descendants? Even to the 2nd generation, to your grandson. V'lokus will not like him, De'ilu Hasam, because in his case, Mikra, Mishnah, Talmud, Halachos, V'agados. He taught Torah. He taught Mishnah. He taught Talmud. He taught Halacha and Agada. V'ilacha, but here, in terms of what the actual obligation of a father to a son, or even a grandfather, it's Mikra Levad. Only Mikra, only Torah is part of the requirement. Asks the Gemara, Ve'avi aviv mi mechayev? Is a grandfather really obligated to teach his grandson Torah? Ve'hatanya, but we have a Brisa. The Brisa says, Ve'limadatem osam es b'nechem, ve'lo b'nei v'nechem. It says, in the verse, it says, Ve'limadatem osam es b'nechem, you shall teach your sons. V'lo b'nei v'nechem. We infer, but you don't have to teach your grandson. Only your son. So we see you don't have to teach your grandson. Continues the Brisa, Umani Mekayim. So if it's true that you don't have to teach your grandson, so how do I explain, how do I establish the verse that says, V'hodatem livanecha v'livnei vanecha? You should tell them over to your sons and your grandsons. Sounds like you do have to teach your grandsons. So this Brisa holds, Lomar lecha, that's to tell you, Shikolam elamed es beno Torah, that if you do teach your son Torah, Ma'ala alav akasav kilu lamdu lo v'livno uleven beno. The Torah considers it as if you taught him, his son, his grandson, atov kol hadoros, till all future generations. Meaning, what it means, what it's saying, according to this opinion, is teach your son. If you do, you are thereby teaching your grandson and his sons, because they will continue to pass on the chain of tradition, but not that you have an actual obligation to teach your grandson. So ask the Gemara. We're trying to say, the Gemara started with the question, until what extent, until what point is a person obligated to teach their son Torah? The Gemara understood at this point that meant till what generation? It said even to your grandson, like the case of Zvulun ben Dan. Ask the Gemara. But you don't have to teach your grandson. It says teach your sons, and we infer but not your grandsons. Says the Gemara that when we answered that you in fact do have to teach your grandsons, we weren't going with that opinion of the Brisa, rather like the following. Huda Amar Ki Aitana. He holds, this answer holds like the following, Tana. The Tanya that we learned in a Brisa, V'limadatem osam es b'nechem. You should teach your sons. Ein liyala b'nechem. I only know that you have to teach your sons. B'nei v'nechem minai. How do I know you have to teach your grandsons? Talmud Lomar. The Torah says, V'odatam livanecha v'livnei vanecha. That verse, you should teach your sons and your grandsons. You should tell it over to your sons and your grandsons. So, indeed, according to this brisa, you do have an obligation to teach your grandsons. In Cain. So if that's true, Ma Talmud Lomar b'nechem. So why does the Torah say you should teach your sons, which we infer are not your grandsons? That can't be. We're saying now you do have to teach your grandsons. Says the Gemara, b'nechem v'lo b'noseichem. That's teaching you. You have to teach your sons, but not your daughters. That's what we infer. Not your sons and not your grandsons. That's not the inference. Indeed, you do have to teach your grandsons. That's learned from a different verse. Rather, b'nechem v'lo b'noseichem. You have to teach your sons, but not your daughters. There's no obligation to teach your daughters Torah. So it comes out, it's a machlokas whether you have an obligation to teach your grandsons. But our Gemara that gave the answer that how far does it extend, does the obligation extend, it even extends to the grandsons, is holding like the opinion that you do have to teach your grandsons. Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said, Kol ha-melamed es ben beno Torah. Anybody who does teach their grandson Torah, Ma'ala alav hakasav kilu kibla mehar Sinai. The Torah considers it as if he accepted it from Har Sinai. I guess what it's telling you is that we are all part of the chain of tradition from Har Sinai. When you teach your son, your grandson especially, because I guess that really shows the chain, so to speak. You hear it from your father, it's one thing. You hear it from your grandfather, that really takes it back. So the Torah considers it as if he accepted the Torah from Har Sinai. Shenemar, and we see this in the verse because it says, V'odatam levanecha v'livnei vanecha, and you should teach your sons and your grandsons. And then in the very next verse, it says, Yom asher amadta lifnei Hashem b'samachle. The Gemara says, and it juxtaposes right next to it. It says, Yom asher amadta lifnei Hashem elokecha b'charev. The day that you stood before Hashem at Har Sinai. In the very next verse. So we see that there's a connection here between teaching your grandsons and the day that we stood by Har Sinai. When you teach your grandsons, that really ties them back to Har Sinai. It's as if they accepted the Torah at Har Sinai. Rabbi Chia bar Abba Ashkechei Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Dishadi Disna Areshe the Kamanti Levi Nukala Bekanista. Rabbi Chia bar Abba, he came across Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, who had tossed like a covering, some kind of light handkerchief or something on his head as a head covering, and he was bringing his child to the shul, to the gathering, the Beis Knesset, where I guess he was going to learn. Amar lei, so Rabbi Chia bar Abba said to Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, "My kuliyai, what's all this? Why don't you take the time to put on your proper yarmulke? You threw some kind of head covering on, and rushed out. What's the rush? You should get yourself properly attired before going out." So Amar lei, so Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi responded to him, "Mizutar my dechsiv odatam levanecha." He said, Mizutar, is it nothing to you? Is it so little to you? That which the pasuk says, you should teach your sons. And then it juxtaposes it with the verse that it's like the day that you stood at Har Sinai. In other words, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said, this is very important business I'm on. I'm taking my child to learn Torah. I don't have time to get fully attired and put my normal head covering on. I just had to rush and throw whatever I had on my head. So such an important thing ties your child back to Har Sinai. So The Gemara reports that Mikan Va'ilach, from then on, Rabbi Chia bar Abba, who had asked the question to Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi and heard this answer, so Lo Taim Umtza de Mikri Lianuka, he wouldn't eat meat in the morning until he taught his child Torah. Umosfem, he reviewed what he had learned and added new things. So they used to eat, at least he apparently would eat meat in the morning usually, as part of his breakfast. And after he heard this, he would not eat his breakfast, his meat, until after he had finished teaching his son some Torah. Because he realized this is how you have to start off. You got this comes first. This takes precedence. He learned that from Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi. Rabbi bar Rav Huna also lo time umtzad damaisi lenukul beis midrasha. He also wouldn't eat until he had brought his child to the beis medrash to learn. Then he would eat his meat. Amar Rav Safra mishum Rabbi Yehoshua ben Chananya. Rav Safra said in the name of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Chananya. We're on the first wide line now, the medium-sized lines. What is the verse teaching you when it says Vishinantam levanecha, and you should teach your son? Now Vishinantam is a bit of an interesting word. It could have said Vishanisem, you should teach. Vishinantam has a connotation of like shinun is sharpness. You got to teach him. You got to teach it well. So the Gemara says, Al tikri vishinantam elo vishilashtem. What this teaches me, by changing the word, is don't read it as vishinantam elo vishilashtem. Now that's a hard thing to understand because it says vishinantam. It doesn't say vishilashtem. It doesn't say anything like that. So again, I think the understanding is, at least one understanding is, that it's really saying, it could have said vishanisam, you should teach. It says vishinantam, you should make it sharp. So what that teaches you is vishilashtem. You should divide it up in three. In order to make it sharp, you have to divide it up. Which means what? Le'olam yishalish adam shnosav. A person should divide up, literally, their years, shlish b'mikra, and spend a third learning mikra, Torah, chumash, shlish b'mishnah, a third learning mishnah, shlish b'talmud, and a third learning Talmud. Ask the Gemara, Mi yeda kama chai, does a person know how long they're going to live? You don't know how long you're going to live. How can you divide up your years and say, okay, I'm going to live till 90, I'll do 30 years of Mikra, 30 years of Mishnah, 30 years of Talmud? The person doesn't know how long they're going to live. So, rather, the Gemara says, Lo tricha, no, that's not what we mean. What we need it for is liyomi, for days. During a given week, they should divide up their days and do a third of their days each week of Mikra, a third Mishnah, and a third of Talmud. And I guess you have, that's 6 days, Shabbos left over, you review everything on Shabbos. That's my own addition. Now again, we don't necessarily practice this specifically. We do learn in that order. We start with Mikra, we start with Chumash, then we go on to Mishnah, and then to Talmud. But the method of education has changed over the years as, in many ways, as our needs and society has changed. We want to meet the needs. We want to amplify and increase and ensure the most Torah being learned based on the conditions at hand. But this is the Gemara's recommendation at that time, is a third of one's time in Mikra, in Chumash, a third in Mishnah, and a third in Talmud. Okay, now the Gemara shifts to a different topic, and it says, Lefikach nikru rishonim sofrim. For the following reason, the early sages were called sofrim. Here, sofrim means counters, like mispar, to count, a number. Shayu sofrim kol osio shebatar. They were called sofrim because they would count the letters of the Torah. Shayu omrim, and they said, vav digachon chatzyon shel osios. The word vav, of the word gachon, the letter vav, in the middle of the word gachon means a belly. It's a verse, I think, in Parshas Shmini, I believe, that it says there, kol holech al gachon, it's talking about what you can eat, what you can't eat. It says anything that goes on its belly. That vav Chatzyan shel osio shel Sefer Torah. That's the middle letter of the letters of a Torah. The Vav of Gachon. Then it says, Darosh Darash, the verse Darosh Darash, which is, I think in the previous Parshas, this may also be it's also in Shmini. The word Darosh Darash, which means that Moshe was seeking out. He was seeking out a certain animal for a karban. Chatzyan shel tevos. That's halfway of the words. That's the halfway point of the words of the Torah. So the halfway point of the letters is different than the halfway point of the words. Darosh Darash is the halfway point of the words. V'hiskalach, the verse V'hiskalach and he should shave, talking about the purification of someone with tzaras in Parshas Tazria. So that is Shal Psukim. That's the halfway point of the verses. So we have the halfway point of words, the halfway point of the halfway point of letters, the halfway point of words, now the halfway point of the verses of the Torah. Now we shift to Tehillim. Yikar semena chazir miyar. Literally, I think the boar of the forest will consume it, but the point here is ayin diyar, the ayin in the middle of the word ya'ar, forest, chatzin shel Tehillim. That's the halfway point of the letters of Psalms of Tehillim. V'hu rachum yichaper avon, and this verse, v'hu rachum yichaper avon, and he is merciful, he forgives iniquities, which is in chapter 78 of Tehillim. So that is Chatzia of the Psukim. That's the halfway point of the verses of Tehillim. By Rav Yosef posed the following question about the first teaching. Vav de Gachon. This that we say that the letter Vav of Gachon is the middle letter of the Torah. Mehai Gisa, Mehai Gisa. Which side is it on? Meaning he seems to be assuming that there are actually an even amount of letters in the Torah, and therefore there's no letter that's actually right in the middle. So it's one of the middle letters. So he wants to know, is the Vav the middle letter on the first side, of the first half, or the middle of the second half? Because there's actually going to be two middle letters if there are an even number of letters. So the Gemara says, Amar le Abaye said to him, Psuki, I skipped, Amar le, so they said back to him, it doesn't say who responded. It could be Abaye. Abaye said, Nesi Sefer Torah v'nimninu. Let's bring a Sefer Torah and count. You want to know if the Vav is the first half or the second half? We'll bring a Torah and we'll count the letters. Milo Amar Rabba bar Chana. Don't we have an account involving Rabba bar Chana that he said, Lo zazu mishamat sheviu Sefer Torah l'manam. Whatever it was that they were counting in that story, he says there was a story involving someone that Rabbi bar Chana reported that they didn't leave there until they counted. They brought a Torah and they counted the letters. So Abaye says, let's do the same thing. We'll count the letters. Amar le, so Rav Yosef said back, Inu biki b'chaseros v'yaseros. They were experts in the missing letters and the extra letters. Anan lo biki'inan. We are not biki'in. We are not experts. In other words, sometimes you can have a word that could be read the same way, whether there's a Vav or not, let's say. For example, there could be a Vav that makes the O sound, a Cholam sound, or you could have it without the Vav. You could just have a dot. Now in the Torah there's no dots, obviously, but you can have a word. It either has a Vav making the O sound or doesn't, and it still makes the O sound. So he said, we're not experts. We don't know for sure that all our Torahs are exactly correct in terms of those Yaseris v'chaseris, those extra Vavs or missing Vavs. It could be that they're not exact, and therefore we wouldn't be able to calculate what the actual middle letter of the Torah should be because we may have an extra Vav here, a missing Vav there, we don't really know. By Rav Yosef then asked another question. V'hiskalach. We said that the word v'hiskalach is the halfway point of the psukim in the Torah. So, mehai gisa or mehai gisa? Which halfway point, again, assuming there's actually an even number of verses in the Torah, is this the end of the first half, or is it the beginning of the second half? Amar le Abaye said, Psuki miyolesu, limnu yuli b'psuki. He says, at least the verses we know. This one we could do. We know the verses, we can count the verses, and miyolesu limnu, let us count them. So Rav Yosef said, nope. B'psuki nami lo b'ki'inan. We don't know all the verses necessarily. We don't necessarily have the correct divisions of verses. Dikiyasa Rav Acha bar Ada, because when Rav Acha bar Ada came, Amar, he said, B'ma'arava paski le'lahai kra l'tlasa psuki. There's a verse that we have as one verse. He's saying in Eretz Yisrael they have it as three verses. The verse is, Vayomer Hashem el Moshe, and Hashem said to Moshe, Hinei anochi ba elecha ba'av ha'anan. I'm going to come to you in the thickness of a cloud. And then he says, Ba'avur yishma medabri imach, in order that the nation hear me speaking to you. Now that in order is not actually connected to the previous words, like Hashem said, I'm coming to you in the thickness of a cloud. So therefore, in Eretz Yisrael, they had that as separate verses. We have it as one verse. So, says Rav Yosef, we're not even sure that we have the correct division of verses exactly, and therefore we wouldn't be able to rely on our own count to determine where this verse, the Hiskalach, is. Is it from the first half of the second, or the second half? Because maybe there's more verse in the first half than we think, or less, and maybe in the second half there's more or less. We don't know exactly where it will fit in. Fine. One more idea here. The Gemara says, Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Chameshes alafim ushmona meos ushmona psukim habu psuki sefer Torah. There are 5,888 verses in the Sefer Torah. Others say there's a different version that says 842, 5,842. There's different ways to count, but the way that our version of the Gemara has it is 5,888. And again, according to the Gilyon Hashas here says there's other versions that say 5,842. Big discussion about these exact calculations, but for now we'll just accept it at face value, 5,888, and that's how many verses are in a Torah. Yes, or I love Tehillim, Shmona. Tehillim has 8 more than that. Tehillim would have 8 more than however many verses are in the Torah. And Chaser Mimanu Divrei Hayamim Shmona. And Divrei Hayamim in the Book of Chronicles, some say Daniel with Divrei Hayamim, has 8 less than that. So if the number was 5,888, so it would be saying that it's 5,880. Again, others say it's really 5,842. I think according to that, maybe these calculations don't line up. Some say that this whole thing is an error. It was inserted later, different things, big discussion about these calculations. They don't seem to be exact according to our counts. It becomes the subject of discussion in the commentaries. Okay, thanks for listening. We will continue in Mirz Hashem next week.